Okay, let's jump right into a situation that's creating some serious tension. We've got a major state, California, in a legal and political, well, showdown with the federal government.
Yeah, a real fight over control of its own National Guard.
That's the heart of this deep dive, isn't it?
Hmm.
We're pulling from sources detailing this really pointed clash between California and the Trump administration.
Right, specifically about federalizing California National Guard troops. And interestingly, there's even mention of potentially deploying Marines.
And our sources here are pretty direct, giving us different angles. We've got a letter, like, straight from Governor Gavin Newsom's office.
That's the core one, yeah. But we also have reports on reactions, what was supposedly happening on the ground, and statements from the president himself.
So our goal today is to really unpack these. We want to understand, what exactly happened, get into the legal arguments.
The different perspectives presented in the material.
Exactly, and try to figure out why this particular moment is so significant.
Let's dive in then.
Okay, so according to the sources, things really kicked off on June 7th, 2025.
Mm-hmm.
That's when President Trump issued a memorandum. And this memo specifically invoked a federal law, 10 U.S.C. Section 1 through 406.
Right, and the purpose of that, according to the memo as reported, was to call California National Guard members into federal service.
Why? What was the stated reason?
Well, the memo said it was to protect ICE and other federal personnel, federal property, things related to federal functions, including law enforcement.
Okay. And also to execute federal laws if regular forces couldn't handle it.
That's what was stated, yes.
And the scale of this call-up.
It was significant. 2,000 Guard members.
Wow. And when?
Effective immediately for a period of 60 days.
60 days. Okay. So how did California respond? Swiftly, I imagine.
Very swiftly and pretty forcefully.
Hmm.
Our sources have this letter sent directly to the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
Who sent it?
It came from Governor Newsom's legal office, signed by the Legal Affairs Secretary, David Sapp, and they made sure the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, was copied. So all the key legal players.
And what's the main point California makes in this letter? The central claim?
They really don't pull any punches. The letter just flatly states this federalization is patently unlawful.
Patently unlawful. Okay, that's strong. So what's the core legal argument they're making based on that statute, 10 U.S.C. Section 125 or 6?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, legally speaking. The letter actually quotes the law itself.
Right.
Which does allow the president to call up the Guard for specific reasons, repel invasion, suppress rebellion, execute laws.
The standard stuff you hear about.
Kind of, yeah. But here's the crucial part California jumps on. The law also says these orders shall be issued through the governors of the states.
Ah, through the governors?
Mhm.
And California's argument is?
That this specific order completely ignored that requirement. According to their letter, the directive from the Department of Defense was not issued through the governor.
So it didn't go via Newsom's office?
They say it wasn't transmitted to his office, wasn't approved by him, wasn't ordered by him, nothing. And they even point out, kind of cleverly, that this contradicts the president's own memo, which apparently mentioned anticipating coordination with the governors.
So they're saying the federal government basically skipped a mandatory step defined in the very law they were using.
That's precisely their argument, yeah. It's not just about whether the Guard was needed, but about the process and the authority used. A fundamental challenge there.
Okay, so that's the legal angle.
Okay.
But the letter also brought up practical concerns too, right? What were those?
Absolutely. They argue, look, local law enforcement in LA City and County, they're already handling public safety. They've shown they can protect federal facilities.
So they're saying, we've got this.
Essentially, yes. And they see the federal deployment as actually risky.
How so?
The letter states that deploying the Guard without, the right training for this situation or proper state orders risks seriously escalating things on the ground.
They felt it could make things worse, not better.
Exactly. They argue there's just no current need for the Guard in LA right now, and doing this unlawfully and for such a long period, 60 days.
Yeah.
They call it a serious breach of state sovereignty.
Okay. And it sounds like maybe they suspected a political motive behind it too.
Well, the letter implies that, certainly. It says the action is perceived as intentionally designed to inflame the situation. And at the same time, it prevents the state from using those Guard members where they might actually need them. It ties up state resources.
Right. So given all that, what does the letter actually demand? What's the ask?
It's very direct. Immediately rescind the order. Return the National Guard to state control, period.
And what's the next step anticipated?
Well, the source notes that California is likely moving fast. They expect them to file a lawsuit seeking immediate injunctive relief.
So asking a court to step in and stop the federal order right away.
Exactly. Probably in the next 24 to 48 hours, according to the reporting.
Okay, so this is definitely heading for a court battle, based on what we're seeing in the sources. Let's broaden out. What about other reactions? You mentioned a joint statement from Democratic governors.
Yes, the sources highlight that. Reportedly, every single Democratic governor weighed in on this.
All of them. Wow. And what was their consensus?
They agreed that this attempt, as they saw it, to militarize California is an alarming abuse of power.
Okay. What were their key points in that statement?
Well, first, they really reinforced the idea that governors are the commanders-in-chief of their state's National Guard. That's fundamental.
Right.
And they called any federal activation within a state's borders without consulting the governor ineffective and dangerous.
And did they address that mention of using active duty Marines?
They did, yeah. The statement reportedly condemned threatening to send U.S. Marines into American neighborhoods.
Which Secretary Hegseth was reported to have done?
Apparently from Camp Pendleton, yes. The governors argued this undermines the mission of our service members, it erodes public trust, and it shows the administration does not trust local law enforcement.
Strong words.
Very. They basically closed by saying they stand with Governor Newsom and emphasizing respect for the governor's executive authority over their guard.
And Governor Newsom himself, the sources report he had some pretty pointed things to say personally about the administration's actions.
Oh, absolutely. The sources quote him characterizing the actions like inciting and provoking violence, creating mass chaos, militarizing cities, arresting opponents. He called those the acts of a dictator, not a president.
Okay, so very sharp political rhetoric alongside the legal challenges. Now, while all this is happening, this back and forth, what were the sources reporting about the actual situation on the ground in Los Angeles?
Yeah, the reports described a visible presence, both National Guard members and local law enforcement on the streets, particularly outside the federal complex there.
Was the situation calm or?
No. There's reporting suggesting it was escalating.
Really? Why?
Well, one source specifically stated the situation was escalating, and they attributed it directly to the Guard's presence, describing it as intentionally escalating it and calling it the militarization that Donald Trump just did.
Okay, so that source links the escalation directly to the deployment.
Yeah.
What about specific actions? Clashes?
There were reports, yeah. The National Guard reportedly pushing through in a very violent nature against protesters at some point.
And clashes involving local police, too.
Yes, clashes between anti-IC demonstrators and local law enforcement were also reported. And reports mentioned the use of tear gas canisters were seen on the ground, as well as batons or bully clubs, as one source put it, and flashbang grenades being used by law enforcement or the Guard.
Okay, so definitely a tense scene. What about actions from the protesters mentioned in the sources?
Yes, it was reported that protesters were throwing items. Specifically mentioned were bottles being thrown at officers and National Guardsmen.
And there were some concerning reports about injuries or violence.
There were. One source mentioned reports of bloodshed, and it cited a Fox report, but noted that report didn't specify who was responsible for it.
I see.
Another source described what they called a horrific sight of someone apparently being dragged during the protests.
Okay. And the crowd size. How many people were involved?
The numbers reportedly grew throughout the day, starting maybe around 15, but potentially reaching 700 people gathered outside that federal complex.
And what were the protesters demanding, according to the reporting?
The sources said their stated demands were pretty clear. They wanted ICE gone from the area, and they wanted everyone who had been arrested during recent immigration raids to be released.
It's really important here, I think, to note those differing perspectives you mentioned earlier, right? From the sources on the ground.
Absolutely crucial. You have one source really highlighting the Guard's actions as the cause of escalation. And then you have that snippet from the Fox report mentioned, which highlighted protester actions like throwing bottles, and the Guard responding with tear gas and flashbangs while protecting federal buildings.
It just shows how complex these situations are and how different sources can frame the same events very differently.
Exactly. You get different pieces of the puzzle depending on where you look.
Okay, so let's turn finally to the federal perspective.
Yeah.
Specifically, what did President Trump himself say, according to the sources? What was his view on deploying troops like this?
Well, his statements, as they were reported, suggested this wasn't, just a one-off thing for California. He was quoted saying pretty bluntly, we're going to have troops everywhere.
Everywhere. And did he elaborate on, like, the criteria for that?
He was very direct about it, actually.
Good.
He reportedly stated, "The bar for what I'm going to do is whatever I think."
Whatever I think. Okay, so a very broad assertion of authority there.
It seems so. The sources quote him saying he would send the military everywhere in the United States.
Even without using the Insurrection Act. That came up.
Yes, when asked specifically about sending troops even without invoking the Insurrection Act, he reportedly just reiterated, "We're going to have troops everywhere."
And the rationale.
He added they wouldn't let the country be torn apart. He kept emphasizing law and order and stated, "We'll send whatever we need to make sure it's law and order."
Okay. So let's try and pull these different threads together now. This whole situation, drawing from all these sources, it really seems to crystallize a core conflict, doesn't it?
It really does. At its heart, you've got this direct challenge. State sovereignty clashing with perceived federal authority.
Specifically over the National Guard.
Exactly. Who gets to control and deploy the Guard within a state, especially during times of domestic unrest? That's the crux.
And that legal argument California is making, the one hinging on that specific phrase in the law, 10 U.S.C. 12406, about orders going through the governors.
Yeah, that feels like the precise legal flashpoint in this bigger conflict.
Right. It really boils down to, did the federal government follow the rules set out in the very law they used?
Or, as California claims, did they bypass the state's authority in a way the law just doesn't permit? That's the question they're putting before the courts, it seems.
And as those reports from the ground in L.A. really underscore, this isn't just some abstract legal or political debate happening in letters and court filings.
Not at all. It has immediate real-world impacts on communities, on how protests unfold, and, as some sources suggested, on the potential for things to get much worse, much more volatile.
So for you listening, understanding this specific event and seeing the different perspectives captured in these sources, it really helps illuminate how federal power, state authority, the roles of the Guard, local police, federal agents, how they all intersect.
Yeah, especially in these really charged domestic situations.
You can see where the friction points are, especially when leaders at the state and federal level have fundamentally different ideas about keeping order, or even just how to read the laws about using the military at home.
It's definitely a complex, layered situation. You've got the legal text, the political statements, the reality on the street, all tangled together.
And that really brings us to a final thought, something to maybe mull over, building on this material we've looked at. The National Guard has this really unique dual identity, right? Serving both the state governor and the federal government.
Yes.
This whole confrontation, it just raises these profound questions about that status.
Yeah.
You know, these moments of domestic tension, who really holds the ultimate authority? Is it the governor? Is it the president?
And what are the implications when those state and federal leaders are just in complete disagreement, not just on policy, but on how to interpret the actual laws governing the use of the Guard within the U.S.?
It's a dynamic that's, well, it's been tested before throughout American history.
Absolutely. And this specific incident, as documented in these sources we discussed, it just offers a really sharp contemporary look at those exact tensions playing out. Definitely something worth keeping in mind and thinking about.